Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Well, Jason, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're a regular on this show. This is your second appearance.
I love being here.
Jason.
I'm a virgin.
Yeah. and sometime we should talk about one of your other passion projects, the Free State Project in New Hampshire.
For sure.
You're an actual New Hampshireite.
That's right.
Living
the freedom.
And according to your study, you're living in the freest state in America.
That's right. And actually, we discovered this before I lived there. So this is not a...
it's not self-serving.
It's not self-serving.
Yeah,
but,
you move to the freedom as opposed to not calling balls and strikes.
So the science is not skewed.
The science is not skewed.
So you
just
can
putting that out there.
propagandize.
That's right.
The Free State Project.
Yeah, and in one of the editions, Florida actually came in number one.
That's right.
And certainly neither one of us wants to live there. But
Yeah.
it's not a bad place for people. It's just not our preference.
So I was paging through the website about freedom in the 50 states. We should say what specifically we're talking about. And how many times has this been published?
So this is the 7th edition, and we've been working on this for about 15 years. And Jason will tell a little story about its origin, but just to kind of the basics is this is a ranking of the 50 states on their regard in terms of public policies at the state and local level for freedom. And this is the most comprehensive index of freedom that's out there. We don't just study economic freedom, we also study personal freedom. So it's economic freedom, which is fiscal policy and regulatory policy, and then personal freedom or freedom from paternalism is another part of it. And it's about a third, and a third. But again, we were the first ones to put personal freedom in an index. And I think our measures of economic freedom are actually the most robust out there as well. We look at about 230 policy variables. And then look at their respect for freedom, and then we call balls and strikes on who wins and who loses, and it's been a great project. But I don't know, Jason, you want to talk a little bit about the origin, because it has a little bit of a cool origin story compared to most social science projects.
I suppose so. So I was a political scientist at the University of Buffalo at the time. This was 2007, I think. We were trying to figure this out exactly when it was. It might have been late 2007, early 2008. And it was actually a friend of mine who suggested, people need something like this that would have a comprehensive view of freedom at the state level. And I said, that's a great idea. I can collect data. I can get tenure, do political sciencey things with it, as well as do this freedom index. And so I reached out to a bunch of policy experts and some other sort of sympathetic political scientists, and didn't really get interest from anyone except Will, who was at Liberty Fund at the time, and then got a job as a political scientist at Texas State. And so we got together and put this study together, and it came out in February 2009. That was the first edition, and we had data from year-end 2006. It was... it was at the time we definitely wanted to be as scientific as possible, but we kind of weighted all the variables based on kind of how important we thought they might be. And now it's improved so much. Not only have we added more variables over the editions, we've gone all the way back to the year 2000 with annual data, so you can look at how things have changed over time. But we also try to have an objective way of weighting these variables by looking at the dollar value to Americans of each freedom. So it's come a long way, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I'm glad to be around both for our launch that we did in New Hampshire a couple weeks ago with Governor Sununu, and for our launch today at the Cato Institute, which is the publisher. Because in 2009 when it came out, we finished it in 2008, and then I was in Afghanistan when it came out.
That's right.
So we had this big event, or he had to sit in for the big event while I was suffering in Kabul.
You didn't do a presser in Kabul?
No, I guess with Zoom technology now, maybe it would have been more likely to happen. But back then, it was harder to communicate, particularly from Afghanistan. So it's good to be here in the United States. I'm glad the war's over too, by the way.
Yeah, and you mentioned this. Cato is the publisher, but both of you guys are, well, you're the president of the American Institute for Economic Research, and you're some sort of senior scholar. You have a very fancy title there.
That's right. Basically, fancy title at AIER.
Yeah.
An economist, you could say.
Yeah, and it really fits nicely, I think, with the offerings at the American Institute for Economic Research, because one of the things that we've been doing since 1933 is looking at kind of basic data that is useful for everyday Americans, and this definitely fits in that. And that's one of the reasons why we do it too, because it wasn't just a social science project. It's also, hey, let's help Americans understand where there's more or less freedom so that they can make better decisions in their own lives, whether it's businesses, it's legislative staff in state capitals, or it's individuals who just want to vote with their feet.
Yeah, to me, that's the most interesting thing, and maybe more so since 2020. I think a lot of Americans are actually voting with their feet, or at least choosing where to raise their families and where to build their careers and their lives based on where they think they'll be free enough to keep a little bit of their income. And I was more than red pilled, whatever the most radical pill is. I became quite radicalized by the lockdowns.
Yeah.
And people that watch this show know this, because I didn't think I lived in a country where even the worst of the states on your list would ever do things like prohibit people from crossing state borders, or
Right.
prohibit people from leaving their house, or telling certain people they weren't allowed to work. So now these things really matter, and I think I'm not the only one that feels that way. So in a lot of ways, this is a how-to guide for just families that are saying, where do we want to live so that we can not have to worry so much about this stuff.
Yeah, and AIER was a leader in criticizing government policies towards COVID. And so we're very proud of that legacy, because it aged very well, the Great Barrington Declaration. And I wasn't the president there, so I give credit to my predecessor for that. But obviously our institution, I think, was at the forefront, and it was risky at the time. So I kind of give him that credit. Now, there's been some good research. So Ben Powell, a mutual friend of ours and a board member at AIER, actually did some research looking at actually where places had more or less stringent COVID regimes. And so that's definitely worth checking out as well. We cited in here. Fortunately, a lot of these policies are gone now.
Yeah.
Now, we do worry about what could happen in the future, because states where executives, grasp power, shocking that would happen, right? These are places where a lot of those things could still live on in the future, and so we should be, quite alert to that as champions of liberty.
Oh, we had rolling emergency orders in the District of Columbia for years after the emergency ended, and and our mayor just loved those powers. And I don't know why she actually ever gave them up. I think at some point the reality of the gutting of the city's economy probably forced her to.
Yeah, and you've done a great job, I think, highlighting that in your new documentary, where it talks about the kind of abuse of these powers.
Everyone is welcome, and we are partners with the Buckeye Institute on an ongoing litigation project. We're telling the story. They're doing the hard work, which is
it's great to see the kind of ecosystem, not just AIER, but Buckeye with Free the People and so forth. I mean, it's awesome. But on the issue of migration, I mean, one thing that we do find, and again, I think for lay people, they know it, right? They see it. They see the U-Haul index, right? But we are able to, in a social science fashion, really show that when you control, like in statistical, analysis, when you control for the things that a lot of people move for, right? Not everybody moves for liberty. I wish they did, right? But not everybody does, and they move for different types of amenities, the ocean, mountains, nice urban landscapes. They move because of cost of living, things like that. But when you control for those types of variables, freedom still matters to the decisions that people are making, and we're able to show that. And so you might say, well, that's not that much news to people, but it is interesting to see that bear out, because there's a lot of people say, well, Florida's growing because it's got great weather or great beaches or any number of things, Miami. But that's not just it. It's also the policy regime. And so on the margins, people are voting with their feet for freedom away from places that are less free. And you see that with California compared to New York. You see with Florida compared to New York, California compared to Florida, Texas is growing, and again, Texas isn't the most free state. It's actually, I think, number 17 because it doesn't do well on personal freedom, but economic freedom it does well, and that attracts people and businesses. But if you think about regions, like New Hampshire does a lot better than Massachusetts, Indiana does a lot better than Illinois. Nevada and Arizona doing a lot better than California. And so you're seeing that work. And that's one of the great things about our federal system is that we can vote with our feet. And you don't necessarily have to pay a heavy price to do that because we have a pretty good freedom of lawful travel regime in this country.
Yeah, so far.
Yeah. I was giving a talk the other day, and people were shocked when I told them what age group is moving from New York to Florida. So Florida is the number one state for people moving out of New York, right? And New York is the state that's losing the most people to the rest of the country, and it's the least free state. So it used to be that New Yorkers were moving mostly to Connecticut and New Jersey. Now it's Florida. Why are they moving to Florida? Well, one hint of this is to look at the 7-year age groups that the census buckets the population in and see which is the biggest group moving from New York to Florida. And believe it or not, it's 18 to 25-year-olds. That is the group that is most preeminent in New York to Florida movers. So this is not retirees moving for the warm weather. This is young people looking for economic opportunity.
I'm guessing a shift from what it used to be. Like you would move to Florida to protect your savings as you were retiring. But now this is people making a life choice as opposed to a retirement choice.
That's right. And I think, if you've ever been to upstate New York, that's in long-term economic depression. So if you're a young person growing up there, you need to go where the jobs are. If you're in downstate New York, if you're in New York City, the cost of living is so high that if you're a young person, you need to go elsewhere to kind of make your way in the world.
At Kibbe on Liberty, freedom is a lifestyle 24/7, something you live and breathe and wear every day. If that describes you, you need the very best Liberty swag in the market today, just like this shirt I happen to be wearing. Go to freethepeople.org/KOL and check out our exciting merch. You too can love liberty and look cool. When I look at the top 10, I immediately notice two things, at least the top 6. I think those are all states controlled by Republican governors right now, even Nevada, which flipped recently.
Yeah, they tend to be more red states, but also, in the case of New Hampshire and Nevada, they're purple in a way, right?
Yeah.
So the top 5, it's New Hampshire and then Florida, and then after that, South Dakota, Nevada, and Arizona. So that's our top 5. And then you compare that to the bottom 5, where you're talking about New York, which is number 50 by far. It's not even close to number 49, which is Hawaii. And then you have California, New Jersey, and Oregon at the bottom. You see a partisan split there. But the story isn't so simple because there are some red states that aren't doing very well, especially because of personal freedom. States that combine for, I think that respect for for freedom across the board. Like a state like New Hampshire is a live free or die state, right? Mm-hmm. It's a place where people want to be left alone. It's fiscally prudent because of that old kind of thrifty Yankee spirit that I love so much and that Colonel Harwood, the guy who founded AIR, would love so much. But it also has that healthy respect for let's just let people, do their thing as long as they're not infringing on other people's rights, which is kind of how we define freedom. That's how we operationalize our variable, as the social scientists say, right? It's people should be allowed to dispose of their life, liberty, and property as they see fit, consistent with the equal rights of others. And then we take that and we figure out what policies violate or support that.
You would think, and maybe New Hampshire is an example of this, but you would think that a so-called purple state, the Republican-Democrat thing, I don't think is a great way to measure this. It's just a proxy. You notice that trend. But since you guys weight, and I don't know what the weight is in a balance between tax policy and fiscal policy versus personal freedoms, marijuana policy, arrests and criminal justice, it seems like the purple state should kill it if they can do both of those things.
Yeah, and in particular, it's going to be your purple states that are often kind of outside the South and some of these areas that are historically tougher on crime, like, lock them up and throw away the key type of states. Our number one category in personal freedom is criminal justice. And we don't punish southern states and high crime states for having high crime and having high incarceration rates just because they have high crime. We adjust incarceration rates for the crime rate. And so it's really, punishing you if you have just really long sentences or maybe few rights for criminal defendants, right? And so you end up putting more people in prison for longer, even given your crime rate. Then we also look at stuff like victimless crimes arrest rates, so arrests of over 18s for drug violations, liquor law violations, prostitution, gambling. And we have seen that all states, even the more conservative states, are declining in terms of their incarceration rates and victimless crimes arrest rates. They're becoming more liberal, if you will, or libertarian on criminal justice policy. But because all states are moving in that direction, even a state like Texas that has done some criminal justice reform still ends up number 50 on personal freedom because it's still very restrictive on some of those policies. Marijuana's in there as well.
Texas, I would have to say, I'd point out that Texas should be doing so much better than it does.
Yeah, I mean,
it's really
the big part
another performer.
Yeah, personal freedom is the big challenge there. And people might say, well, you're just looking at criminal justice policy. People could disagree about the right mix of that, but it's not just that. I mean, think about Texas is lagging when it comes to educational reform. Other states have beat them. States like Florida, for example, down New Hampshire, others. It also lagged for a long time, even on gun rights. I used to joke with my Navy buddies in Texas when I lived there that Vermont had better gun laws than Texas. And they were like, no, that can't be true, right? Because unfortunately in Texas, and I live there, I love the state, it's a great place. But there's a kind of rhetoric of freedom that isn't always matched when it comes to state and local policy. So you think about like local tax policy, for example, in Texas, or spending is just terrific. And they need to get a handle on that.
Yeah.
But again, Texas does do relatively well on economic freedom. It's a right to work state, for example. State tax burden isn't that onerous. And you see that one of the reasons why they're having economic growth. But it's really the personal freedom side. And again, not just the issue of crime. And again, even kind of diehard red Republicans in Texas realize that the criminal justice issue was a problem for them, because Rick Perry, who's not a libertarian by any stretch, was a leader in this. The Texas Public Policy Foundation was a leader in that, in the right on crime approach. And I think they made some strides.
In some ways, they didn't start the fight, but they sure put it on the map.
Absolutely. I mean, you got to give credit to TPPF and Right on Crime, and I think that's been very helpful. Again, criminal justice reform, I think, is facing some barriers right now, and in some cases, I think that the criminal justice reform effort became a pretty broad tent, which is why it was successful. But some of the margins of that tent may not have had the same concern about public safety that actually is why. I mean, like, unless you're an anarcho-capitalist, and even if you are an anarcho-capitalist, you want to have some type of body, whether private security or, in the case of people like me, you want to have public security that is keeping us safe in terms of our private property.
Squish.
Squish. Yeah.
Well, we've done a lot of work on restorative justice, and a very important documentary that became sort of a working toolkit for places that wanted to rein in mass incarceration. But what's happened is that the phrase itself has been hijacked, and restorative justice is a very arduous process by which people that commit a crime, make a mistake, have a way to make it right. And a lot of people won't choose it because it's too hard to actually look your victim in the face and say, I screwed up. But what's happened, and I think I'll pick on the state of Oregon, which, by the way, is number
46.
I think
46.
46. It's fallen a lot.
They've replaced, and a lot of your worst states have replaced this, or never actually implemented this process. They've instead they have catch and release, which is not restorative justice at all.
Right.
No.
And it actually makes things worse. So I think we have to be clear that real criminal justice reform and real restorative justice are not soft on crime. They're just acknowledging the fact that these are people that will be part of our society, and how do we do this in a way that makes both fiscal
Yeah.
and legal sense.
And if you're going to have government, the primary job of government should be to protect private property. I mean, crazy idea like that, right?
Yeah.
And so, so I think like the defund the police movement, I think that harmed the criminal justice efforts. I mean, I don't have data on if that's actually harmed it, but it seems empirically that
Sure,
there's
it has
been
rhetorically
yeah.
devastating, and
But we
again,
should still fight for it. I mean, if it's right
Yeah.
to do, it's right to do, and that means like excessive sentencing is something we should work on. It doesn't mean no sentencing, like you said,
Right.
but excessive sentencing, or something like the militarization of policing, which is still a real challenge. Civil asset forfeiture problems, right? That goes back to that protection of private property, right? Government shouldn't be able to take your property without engaging in the appropriate due process.
what's the go ahead?
Oh, and just by the same token, I don't know, maybe this is more controversial at this table, but it's been disappointing to see drug legalization kind of tainted now by those states and cities that have allowed public drug consumption, which, you know, people have fears about. Like, I don't want to be walking with my kid down the street past a guy who's shooting up. And, you know, you can allow people to do things in the privacy of their own homes or, you know, consenting private property indoors without having that kind of open air drug consumption that I think is causing a backlash on that.
Thank you for joining me today on Kibbe on Liberty and for being part of our fiercely independent audience. Every week, my organization, Free the People, partners with BlazeTV to bring you this show. My guests bring smart perspectives on everything from current events to timeless philosophical debates. If you like what you hear, go to freethepeople.org/KOL and support Kibbe on Liberty so we can continue to produce these honest conversations with interesting people. Now, let's get back to it. Yeah, well, we libertarians sometimes lean into these false caricatures because I think freedom and responsibility go together. And if you're trusting people to be responsible with drugs, and I think we should legalize everything.
Right.
And I have very much looked at Portugal as a model by which you could do that. But that doesn't mean that we don't hold bad behavior and publicly destructive behavior accountable.
Yeah.
It's quite the opposite. If you decriminalize everything, we can then take care, either with a carrot or a stick, people that are in trouble.
Yeah, and we need to see an establishment of norms to provide, I think, the kind of appropriate boundaries, if you will, so that we don't get a backlash that leads to more coercion.
Yeah.
And you know, again, maybe it's just early and we're going to see the evolution of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think when it came to vaping, for example, that lots of places said, you know, look, you can do it, but no indoor use, right? And that's the establishment of a norm without government having to say that. A lot of businesses would do that on its own, and I think that you could see some development of norms here. The problem is just like with people on cell phones, on airplanes, or in public spaces, the norm development doesn't happen fast enough for most of us,
Right.
right? And so how do you do that? And especially given that, we live in a world in which on some issues people are massively judgy, and in other issues it's like, don't judge me, man. And so a friend of mine said you should.
We're both at the same time.
Yeah, we're both at the same time. Yeah, like the most massive cigarette bans on any type of consumption of cigarettes at the same time is a very different attitude towards another way of doing it. So it's very weird. But again, I mean, I think our study is very definitely rooted in a kind of classical liberal worldview, libertarian worldview, if you will. But I think that conservatives and liberals can see some value in it as well. So it's not just for libertarians. I mean, again, we have a range of issues that people could look at, and they could even look at it and say, I want to weight these differently than you do. So, for example, gun rights and education policy might look pretty conservative to many people. Whereas the incarceration rates, drug arrests, those things, some people might say are more liberal. Again, we think that it's a unified whole. I mean, we agree with Milton Friedman that freedom is a whole. Economic freedom is important. You have to be able to own the means of production. You have to be able to own your own labor. Onerous taxation is not just a restriction in some ways on your economic freedom, it's also a restriction on your personal freedom. Like, how can you live your life project as you see fit without being able to generate the means to do so? And so again, like, I think that one of the one of the things we are both proud of in this study is that we're not cherry picking policies. We're looking at 230 of them. And that means there's a little bit of something for everyone. People will nitpick. But again, no single policy is such a big part of it that that's driving it. I mean, even tax policy, right? The tax burden is a high percentage, but it's not 40% of the index.
Yeah. So Jason, what's the on economic issues? You would immediately go to tax policy and say this is going to drive the results. But what are the things that we don't think about as much that really determine economic freedom in a state?
Yeah. So our second most important economic freedom category is land use and energy freedom. And I think this is getting its due now, finally, in the public conversation with all the worry about housing prices. I mean, certainly it's huge in New England. I went down to Tennessee this week. It's huge in Tennessee. Everyone all over the country is talking about house prices and rents and how they've gone up in the last few years. And a lot of that's due to land use regulation, especially local zoning regulations that are restrictive, that prevent landowners from building homes. That reduces the supply of housing. And so in a growing society where people need homes, it's just pushing up the price. So that ends up being a very big part of the index. I think it's 11%. Energy, we throw in there as well because it's another cost of living driver. A lot of states are mandating that utilities buy renewable energy no matter what it costs and pass those costs on to electric consumers. We think that's kind of a bad way to deal with air pollution or whatever negative externalities you want to talk about. Forcing these utilities to buy renewable energy, it drives up the cost of electricity, and that hurts your manufacturing sector too, because they end up having to use a lot of power to make stuff.
Total tangent, but you guys are probably aware of the fact that these renewable mandates in Hawaii very much diverted resources away from fire prevention. one of the key drivers of many government failures drove the tragedy in Maui, which apparently we don't talk about that much anymore. But renewable mandates was certainly one of them.
Yeah, that was definitely a tragedy. I mean, I've been there, so just to see the pictures of that place burned down is terrible.
But there's a lot of random things, and I recall a couple years ago I was involved in exploring energy policies in Nevada, and there's a lot of centralization driven by government-controlled, even government-run utilities, and the push should be for actual energy freedom, where if you generate renewables, a lot of states you're not allowed to actually own that energy. You have to sell it back to the monopolist, and then they charge you double for it. It's really disgusting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're moving toward a future in which energy can be distributed and decentralized, and we don't need these big monopoly networks anymore. We have home-based solar. People are talking about modular nuclear right around the corner. So there are going to be a lot of options out there, and we need to think about how we foster choice and competition in energy. Yeah,
and again, an important finding that we have in the study that supports every economist since Adam Smith that's worth their salt, right, is that the economic freedom correlates greatly with per capita income growth. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's an important thing, particularly for attracting people in terms of the out-migration, in-migration question, but also in terms of just our general flourishing. Yeah. And the more regulation you have, the greater the tax burden, that's going to stymie people's ability to grow the economy. And one of the great things about our system is we have federalism, in which states have a lot of power, but there are ways in which federalism can be a problem, because not only do you have the federal level as a potential regulatory burden on people, but then you also have states. And so you can get a double whammy there. And the good thing, at least, again, is as long as we have the freedom to vote with our feet, that's going to put a constraint on governments, because they lose tax dollars. And that's one of the reasons why in our study, the greater decentralization you have, even within a state, is important, because more decentralization within a state means more ability to even vote with your feet within a state or within a region. Yeah. And that puts pressure on governments. And again, government is not going to do the right thing on its own. The incentives matter.
What?
Exactly. Well, I mean, again, there is. I mean, I I studied public policy with one professor. You'd think that she believed that everything was just like a bunch of like well-meaning, well-intentioned technocrats trying to make things right. It's not to say that all bureaucrats are bad people, right?
That is the myth of public policy.
Yeah. But again, let's just assume that not all of them are so well-intentioned, even if some of them or even most of them were. It's important to have those constraints so that they almost have to be forced to do the right thing. And again, that's why there are problems. Like Hawaii, for example, has a single school district. That means, for the entire state. That means you don't have that type of competition that you can get in other places. And so, like in New Hampshire, there are some places that tuition out their students to private schools, and that's an advantage for them. Other places, they're going to spend more or less. And one of the dangers in a place like New Hampshire is that this will become only a state-level issue. With funding at the state level, and so there could be less competition even below the state, and that's very dangerous. We should resist that. And again, there's also that check because in a smaller community, not only can you vote with your feet, but you can use voice, not just exit, but voice, and speak up in a way that's not. It's more likely to be heard at your local town meeting than it is, like say, in a state like California or Texas, where your chance to go to the legislature and actually be important compared to the teachers union or any other special interest group is going to be limited. In a place like New Hampshire, you could actually use that voice in an effective way.
Yeah, this relates to my pet theory of California, which is that California gets away with a lot because it's so big, just geographically even. And, it's got a nice climate, best climate on Earth, some people say. Not me, but some people. And, there's less
you
competition.
You prefer 10 degrees in New Hampshire?
I like the seasons. I like to ski, in the winter, and I like to garden in the summer.
So let's talk about, since you mentioned California, there's this great word that became a Red Hot Chili Peppers song called Californication.
Yeah.
And it originally referred to those damn Californians migrating into Oregon and screwing everything up. Right. And one of the great concerns, mostly amongst Republicans, is that with people fleeing blue states, they're going to bring the stupid with them and Californicate Florida.
That's right.
Or Massachusetts, Massachusettsification.
Massachusetts.
But that doesn't seem to be happening.
Right,
like the flood of New Yorkers moving to Florida has actually, if anything, moved the state a little bit more red.
So much of it depends on who's moving, right?
Yeah.
What are the kind of political ideology or political culture that people have when they go? And I think for some of the early worries, it was a place like Montana, where the people going there were actually kind of like hippie lefty types, or rich lefties, right, that could have a second home there.
I mean, this happened to Burlington.
Vermont
used to be a very conservative place.
To the Bernie Sanders
but if you're a tax refugee from Massachusetts moving to New Hampshire, or you're an upstate New Yorker looking for something different than what you're getting from Albany and moving to Florida, that's a different type of person. And again, that's why migration in general, both international and within the U.S., is potentially fraught, because unlike goods and services, people have ideas that they bring with them. And so you can imagine that, if you have a whole slew of folks that are kind of like hate Albany, want to resist what New York City is trying to do and go to New York, that could move the state actually to the right. Whereas, you could see, one of the big worries, I think, about a place like New Hampshire is, are the tax refugees balanced by the kind of people that are attracted to Vermont, but maybe they're priced out of that market?
Yeah, or they're just looking for jobs, right? So they're coming from all over the country for jobs, but they don't necessarily know what's supporting that economic dynamism, and
which is why you got to educate people about, hey, this is why the state is doing well. And so, in a sense, like a kind of state level civic religion isn't a bad thing. I know like a lot of libertarians get squeamish about that, but again, if you're going to have public schools, like, look, a state like New Hampshire or Texas should have part of the curriculum where they're talking about like why we've been successful.
Yeah.
Why live free or die on the license plate is actually not bad propaganda. It's good because it helps, I think, inscribe in people a certain kind of attitude. And again, the little things matter. And I think, again, the license plate is a symbol of that in New Hampshire.
So, yes or no, do we need to build a wall between California and America? You're saying not necessarily.
Not necessarily. I think you can promote this civic religion as a way of assimilating, right, the Californians to the culture they get into. And political scientists have actually found this. They find I think there was a study, if I remember correctly, it was on the Research Triangle area in North Carolina, and they found that places where people moved from liberal areas of the North did become a little bit more liberal, but then they found that those individuals themselves became more conservative. So there's some adaptation to your new environment as well that's happening. So on balance, as freer states are attracting people from less free states, that's making the country as a whole more pro-freedom. But there is still the worry that if you get a real flood then of incomers who don't share the culture, they really could change the culture.
And the reason why we know this, I think that we can guess this is true, is because the non-freedom oriented people in a place like New Hampshire are really angry at the Free State Project because they think they're bringing in people that are going to pollute the place. Whereas I think most what are called pre-staters, people who are actually born there but love liberty, are excited by it because they're actually deepening that tradition. But I do think it's important. I mean, and again, just not to focus too much on New Hampshire, but it is our #1 state in the index. Is one of the ways that the civic religion, if you will, works is a lot of people talk about the New Hampshire advantage. And by keep talking about that, it encourages people to think like, why are we doing better than Massachusetts and Maine and Vermont? It's not just because, hey, we have great tourist industry or something like that. There's something about the policy regime that matters. So you got to keep talking about it.
Yeah. And, this is one reason, my pet theory of Massachusetts. Massachusetts, I think, is number 26 in our latest index. So it's right in the middle, which is a lot better than you might expect.
Better than you would expect,
given how deep blue it is. But the trouble is that Massachusetts' economy is so tied to New Hampshire's. If Massachusetts went crazy, like New York or California, it would drive so much business just over the border. And so they cannot get away with those sorts of
back to competitive federalism,
policies.
Right?
That's right, yeah.
If you've made it this far into the show, it means I must be doing something right. Kibbe on Liberty is just one of the amazing products we created for the people. We tell emotionally compelling stories and produce educational videos for the liberty curious. Our award-winning documentaries personalize all things liberty, independence, creativity, hard work, integrity, and perseverance. After the show, check out our work at freethepeople.org. And if you like what you see, donate to support what we do. That's freethepeople.org. Now back to the show. So I noticed that, and I want to talk about like the top 5 and the bottom 5 or some approximation of that, but I noticed that South Dakota was number 3, I believe, this year. And it looked like, again, my obsession with lockdowns. I mean, South Dakota was the single one place where the governor said, we're not doing any of that stuff. Even Florida, which is celebrated for being skeptical of lockdowns. I mean, they did a lot of that stuff early, and then DeSantis said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. Is there a correlation between the freest states and the states that were skeptical of these more authoritarian measures? Was it cause and effect? Did the lockdowns change the trajectory of some states over the course of the last 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, well, certainly on the first question, I would say yes, that states that are freer in our index, so they're freer on other policies, actually were not as extreme on lockdowns and mandatory masking and things like that. So I believe all of our top 5 were also in the top 10 or so on Ben Powell's lockdown freedom index. And the states that were craziest were places like California arresting surfers. Hawaii was insane, like prohibiting visitors to the state. These were the states that were just more pro-regulation in general. So this is something to think about when you're thinking about where to live. You don't know what those issues are going to be down the road. You don't know what government might be doing. It might not be lockdowns next time. It might be something else that we can't predict. But you're going to be safer in those places that are already respectful of freedom.
Yeah, because they have not just the institutions, and institutions matter a lot. We're studying institutions here, but it's also the political or policy ideology that then helps drive or support the right institutions. And if you have a more free culture, like in a place like you could say, especially on these types of things, a place like Texas or Florida, New Hampshire, or South Dakota, you're going to be more resistant to that. And even if the government doesn't want to do the right thing, the people are going to be hugely resistant to it. And there's a certain limit to which you can buck the kind of policy ideology of a state, even in New York, right? So if they impose the gas stove, restrictions, whether here in D.C. or wherever, there's going to be a lot of shirking, right? And that's going to depend on, I think, kind of the libertarianish culture. And I like the term folk libertarian to describe how a lot of Americans are. Like, I think to say that, like, we can look at it and say Americans is a libertarian country or not, I just don't think it's borne out. I mean, there's certainly big pockets of libertarianism, and you've written on this. But I do think that even among all but like the worst collectivists, there's some of that folk libertarianism in people.
Yeah.
They just don't like to be told what to do. And sometimes that means they say, keep your hands off my Social Security. But I think that's rare. It's more kind of like
the great moral philosopher Neil Peart described this contradiction in Americans between the side of us that thinks through our mind and the side of us that thinks through our heart.
Yeah.
And I think Americans do have some libertarian instincts, but they're also contradictions.
Yeah.
And we discovered when they get scared, they start doing insanely unlibertarian things, and we have to watch for that. But so you're saying that was a ramble tangent. There's my Neil poster.
Yeah.
We have a little shrine up here for the most important
I
moral
loved Rush
philosophers.
before I was a classical liberal, so
it's a gateway drug. So if and I've said this to some of my, like a lot of people I know, moved to Florida and got out of a lot of really bad places, and I look at it and I think, well, what happened? Florida's a purple state, and what happens if the next governor flips and you get a very different set of policies? Are you guys seeing stability in these trends? So if I look at your top 5 and choose one of those states, there's some confidence that it's sustainable.
That's right. So what we see is a relationship between policy change and not so much partisan control of government, but the ideology of the population. And we measure that using partisanship in presidential elections. So we do see that as states move to the left, they tend to lose economic freedom. As they move to the right, they tend to gain economic freedom. One of the biggest examples of this is West Virginia. So it used to be a deep blue state. Now it's a deep red state. So a huge transformation. And as a result of that, they've done things like right to work and other labor law reforms,
educational freedom too,
educational freedom, things that they never would have done had it been a solidly democratic state. So we don't want to say that Republicans are always good, because there are plenty of examples where that's not the case. I mean, look at some of our bottom states on personal freedom. Tend to be deep red southern states typically. But we do see this relationship where what you really don't want to be is a deep blue state, because then you'll lose the economic freedom and you'll also lose all the more right-coded personal freedoms.
So and just so that people know the top 5, can you guys rattle these off just so they know what we're talking about?
Yeah, New Hampshire, Florida, South Dakota, Nevada, and Arizona. And Tennessee's number 6. They were a little upset to have missed the top 5.
And Tennessee's been pretty good as long as you guys have been doing this. Is that right?
That's right. All of these have been pretty good, although it's really remarkable how Arizona and Florida especially have improved over the last, I want to say, 13 years. Really, it's since that 2010 election. It was kind of a wave election, just flipped a lot of state governments. And in Florida, especially under, it looks like the Rick Scott administration, just kind of looking at the data, that seems a time when Florida made a lot of reforms, not just on school choice, but even economic things like reforming insurance regulation and reducing taxes. And then Arizona as well has been really at the forefront of deregulation on things like occupational licensing, very much at the forefront on school choice. So it's been really remarkable to see how those states have improved. We see, for instance, South Dakota used to be our number one back in like 2006 for a few years. It's since been passed and is now number 3, but that's not because it's declined in freedom. It's just that other states have increased faster.
And we shouldn't forget some states that you wouldn't characterize as red, per se, that have been gainers in terms of freedom over the last 22 years. So states like New Mexico and Wisconsin. And again, Wisconsin is not exactly deep red, although it did have Governor Walker, and there were certainly positive improvements under his tenure. But New Mexico improved. Now they're also starting from a pretty low spot. But again, West Virginia is another one. So there are changes. The other thing, too, is that at the state level, unlike at the federal level in many ways, you've seen an increase in overall freedom over the last, decade, I think, in terms of our data. So if I remember correctly, it kind of looks like a check mark. There was a decline in the 2000s then ticked up over the last decade. And that's a good thing if you care about freedom. So we need to reform this neck of the woods, right?
Yeah. Now, importantly, we only see that uptick over the last 12 years or so when we exclude federalized policies,
right?
Particularly health insurance regulation. Right?
Yeah.
So that's
a Washington problem.
That's a Washington problem, but it's very interesting that it supports our ideas about federalism in that it tends to be the case that when the Supreme Court overturns state laws, that tends to increase freedom in our data set. And when Congress does it, it decreases freedom a lot.
Yeah.
Congress is usually taking away.
We can all agree that Congress sucks.
Yeah. But I want to take a little shot at some of our NatCon or post-liberal friends here.
All right.
There's a lot of talk at the national level about industrial policy, tariffs, general protectionism. But one of the things that you need to remember is that, sure, the kind of China shock is some percentage of the decline of American manufacturing in terms of maybe not the output, but in terms of jobs. But technology is a huge driver and differences in regulatory policy. So, Jason was just in Tennessee. Tennessee is a huge manufacturing engine. So you mentioned the wall between California. I would joke with some of my NatCon friends saying, like, if you want to get the Main Street back in Michigan, you need to have a wall between you and Indiana, because Indiana was a regional Midwest beacon of regulatory freedom.
Yeah.
Kansas is our number 1 state for regulatory policy. These are states that are doing better relative to others. So again, like you joke, obviously we don't want a wall between Indiana and Illinois and Michigan, but Illinois and Michigan were suffering because Indiana and other places like Tennessee and others were doing better, not just on right to work, but across the board. I think too often people want to blame free trade for why some particular region might be doing poorly. And it's not to say that aren't issues related to globalization, but policy regimes matter too, and that's one of the success stories of Tennessee.
That's an interesting argument, because when you were talking about Wisconsin, I was thinking about I drive from Illinois to Wisconsin quite a bit, and I smile every time I cross the border and I see all of this business development right across the border, and this started quite a bit with Governor Walker, but it's continued in large part, maybe not because Wisconsin is great, but because Illinois is just a hellhole for running a business.
Yeah. Regional, I mean, being the kind of tallest person in the Wizard of Oz is a big deal, even if you're not tall. That's one of the advantages New Hampshire has, but it also used to be an advantage that Connecticut and New Jersey had relative to New York. And again, places like New Jersey have really slipped, and that means that a place like Florida is more attractive than just going next door. And Connecticut has lost some of that advantage too economically. Certainly Indiana, Illinois, California, Arizona, Nevada. So that regional competition, because again, it's a big deal even for Americans who are relatively highly mobile to move all the way across the country. But how big a deal is it to move from Palm Springs to Las Vegas?
Yeah.
Not as much. And you certainly see that again in New England, where you can cross 3 boundaries in 20 minutes.
Let's talk about the states where, if you're watching this show, you need to get out now.
Yeah.
And we've already talked about New York is number 50. Is
New
that
York's
right?
number 50. Although Hawaii is starting to close the gap. Like Hawaii has just cratered in the last few years, and there was a brief moment when it looked as if the governor was going to do, I think someone called it YIMBY martial law. Basically, by executive decree, suspend a whole huge swath of land use regulations, which are a big problem in Hawaii, and that's caused an immense acute housing crisis there. But then he kind of backed down. So, the political constraints there are just huge. So that's a state where, if you wanna live in paradise, so to speak, you're gonna pay a hefty price. Oregon has gone down a lot. Some of that has been adopting statewide rent caps. That's a policy that economists unanimously oppose as devastating to,
something New York has.
To landlords and tenants alike. I mean, New York's rent control, the research shows that it increases rents. Why?
Because it screws working folks.
Yeah,
but how is it for quality of housing?
Yeah.
Not so good.
Right. So dumb policies like this are making a comeback these days. I mean, I thought we'd gone past that, but we're having to relearn some of these lessons.
Yeah,
all
even
over
Massachusetts got rid of rent control. About 25 years ago?
Yeah, I think it was like late 80s, early 90s. Yeah.
So. But again, that's why you always have to be vigilant about liberty.
So New York, Hawaii, Oregon.
Yeah, California is very bad. California, it's interesting because all these progressive types are writing these California's back pieces in the 2010s, and California did see some good growth in the 2010s, and it has certainly some of the wealthiest counties in America are in the Silicon Valley area. But you have to counterpose against that. The first decade of the 21st century, California had by far the worst economic performance of any state. And so when you look over the last 22 years, California has been well below average in terms of economic performance. And what's interesting is we actually show that their economic freedom improved in 2008, 2009, 2010, right before their economic performance improved. So that's
shocking that Smith is right.
That maybe California, despite some symbolic tax increases and things, they mostly dealt with a great recession by cutting spending and getting their debt under control. And, kudos to them. They got a little bit of a dead cat bounce out of that in the 2010s.
And again, the voting with your feet is a good indicator. It's a revealed preference, and it's. I mean, again, it's not my cup of tea, but it's paradise to a lot of people. Right? San Diego is kind of hard to beat the weather there. And the whole state has lots of virtues, right? You can ski and surf the same day in a place like California if you can bear the traffic, right?
That's the problem.
But and yet you have out-migration. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could kind of understand why some people would want to flee New York, although, again, New York has New York City, which you would think would be a kind of a driver of population growth. The one thing we also like to kind of talk about to make sure people are clear here is that we aren't talking, though, about, like, New York is Burma, or it's Zimbabwe, or it's Ukraine, or Russia, right? New York is still a relatively free place. Let's be careful here, and that's one of the reasons why, if you look at just like absolute population growth, look, they're having, if you're from Burma, you might want to go to New York City. It looks really free compared to that, and so again, we have to. That's why we're looking at. In-migration and out-migration, not looking at, like, are we attracting from abroad? Yeah. But that being said, like, look, they should perform better. I mean, this is a place that is living off a lot of capital that was created by a really free country. I mean, think about Milton Friedman's New York City, right, or his parents, right? His parents worked in sweatshops there, and then they moved out to New Jersey. This was an economic beacon then compared to what it is now.
Yeah, and even with all that international migration, New York State has lost population relative to the U.S. as a whole every single year since 1953.
It's remarkable.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
So meanwhile, people are flooding to South Dakota. Is it because of the climate? No. It's not even because of the pretty mountains. I mean, there are a few out west, but the growth is really concentrated in the eastern part of the state, which is, flat prairie. Why is South Dakota?
Or think about Kansas. Like, it's really good on regulatory policy. That's that's the Kansas advantage.
Right.
You can tell that it's starting to hurt because I don't know if he's still doing it, but Governor Newsom was running ads in Florida, and part of this is surely the anticipated politics of the future, but running ads in Florida reminding former Californians how awesome it was, even though it's too late, like they're not coming back. But there does seem to be sort of this death spiral. Like once you get bad, it's hard to recover, I suppose, until the point where it's so bad that at some point you're Eastern Europe after the Soviet Union fell, and you embrace Milton Friedman's entire free to choose, as happened in whatever that country was.
In a way, you like to see these feedback mechanisms, right? It's a potential constraint. It's a lesson. On the other hand, like, this has always been my problem with the kind of like the Randian, future, which is everything has to crash first. And there's a lot of ruin on the way down.
Right.
I don't want to live in the late empire, for example, right? Yeah. It could be worse than other places, but again, like, you don't want to have to see that. And, look, whether it's New Zealand or Thatcherite Britain, you do have examples where states haven't had to hit rock bottom before they were able to do some reforms. Now, the question is do they reform enough, or does it kind of get good enough to be steady state, not so bad, not so good? And, you'd like to see states try to do more than modest reforms when they are getting, on that decline. But some of it has to be, it's the Mises human action model. You have to have a sense of unease. And I think that's the problem in education policy until COVID, right? Which is a lot of people, just like they love their congressman but hate Congress, they love their local public school, not knowing maybe how bad it was actually doing. And then they were exposed to it on Zoom. They're like, oh my goodness, what the heck's going on here? And then you've seen policy entrepreneurs take advantage of that sentiment. And so there has to be, like, I think for people like us in our space, we have to raise the alarm about this is not good. You're losing people. You're losing economic growth. You might think you love your legislature or your home state. It's not doing well. Let's shine a beacon on that, and hopefully they can reform. And policy entrepreneurs, like, we've talked to a lot of state legislators, legislative staff over the years, and they ask us, how can we do better? And again, like, we don't think freedom in the 50 states on its own is going to change the world dramatically, but it's part of that ecosystem of shining lights on problems, giving tools to people. And this is a tool that they can say, okay, like, tell us how we can improve on regulatory policy. Or I wasn't aware of how bad we were getting relative to other states. Or even, like, when you shine a light on Texas's, bad gun policies compared to Vermont, you can kind of name and shame, like, Vermont, pink as a baby's ass, right? Like, how could they have better gun policies? Now, again, Vermont has slid on gun policy freedom. But again, shining that light, especially in regions like Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana don't want to be really the worst in the region. Shine that light.
Yeah. So you mentioned this, and this will be the last question. I'm curious about education policy, and I would assume, like, because we watch this dynamic where parents in lockdowns and remote learning, they had to actually look at the curriculum for the first time, and they had to see firsthand that even the teachers that they thought were taking care of their kids were captured by this union that clearly cared more about it than children. So I would assume some people migrated. They're like, I'm leaving this state because my child cannot thrive here. But others came up with lots of education alternatives outside the system. Others went to the state capitol and forced. There's a lot of really good school choice reform now. Who's the best? Like, who are the best states, and were they always that way, or is this something that, again, was forced by parents waking up?
I mean, Arizona and Florida have always been sort of the leaders on educational choice. And that's really still the case. I mean, Arizona was the first state to adopt universal ESAs. And it's really cool to see policymakers pushing the frontiers of what's out there, because this is a policy that didn't exist until a couple of years ago. And now we can include that in our study and credit these states for advancing freedom on these fronts. One of the other issues that we look at is private and homeschool regulations. And so some states do okay on school choice, but still have a lot of those regulations. And so that's one of the things in our study. We highlight that, and we kind of advocate, let's remove some of these restrictions. Like, why do private school teachers need to be licensed by the state? Why should they follow the same procedures that a public school teacher follows? I mean, we know that education schools are not teaching a lot, in terms of actual ability to teach, right? And so why should we require an education degree or an MA or whatever?
I mean, I think we would have difficulty as long-running political scientists getting a job teaching social studies.
Yeah,
in
we'd
a
have
lot
to
of
jump through a
places.
lot of hoops
Yeah.
to get licensed to teach K-12.
Well, you got to protect the children.
That's right.
You know.
I had a buddy here in D.C. who, and this was quite a while ago, maybe 10 years ago. He wanted to take a break from politics, and he had a law degree and he had a master's in something else. He did not have a PhD, but he was not qualified to teach in D.C. schools.
Wow.
And that obviously had nothing to do with his qualifications. So it's a real thing. It's like these unions don't want quality competition or something.
Well, that's why Right to Work is in this study. And when we were up in New Hampshire for the launch with Governor Sununu, they asked us, what can we do to become even better? And I think the governor and you both said Right to Work at the same time. I said greater educational choice.
Yeah.
Because I think that's important for the future of liberty in so many ways. Is what we do, when it comes to children.
Yeah. And New Hampshire's done a fair amount of that, but New Hampshire's a state where there's some of these regulations on private schools that probably need to be rolled back.
But Right to Work, that would be. I mean, again. There are some states that could really use it. It would help them jump in the rankings, especially if they were already doing well, like New Hampshire.
Okay, lightning round. Let's talk about the Free State Project, AIER, and where people get the book.
Yeah, Free State Project.
And you're the founder, right? Is that?
That's right. I started it back in graduate school 20 years ago, roughly, and we got together to find a state where libertarians, classical liberals, people who advocate strictly limited government and individual liberty could move and get active and create a culture of liberty and build on a pre-existing culture of liberty. And we ended up choosing New Hampshire. And since then, thousands of people have moved to New Hampshire. They've gotten elected. They've passed legislation. I think it's a big reason why New Hampshire's taken back its #1 crown in this index. And so it's been really cool to observe that. I myself moved 10 years ago. It's a really neat community. You can find many different libertarian subcultures there and plug into whatever is more of your interest. Not everyone works on politics and policy. Some work on education or kind of like agorism, free market types of things.
Living freely.
Yeah,
yes.
Just living freely and helping others live freely and creating that network.
I mean, it is on the license plate, so.
Yeah. So yeah, you have to come and visit. I mean, you come to PorcFest all the time, but for your listeners out there, porcfest.com, and you can visit our website at fsp.org.
We do a lot of shows from PorcFest, and every year when I go back, people come up and say, I came here because I saw the show and it looked cool. It really is sort of, as someone that I claim to be the intellectual bastard of Ayn Rand and Jerry Garcia, PorcFest is my home.
That's right. You'll find that.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. AIER.
Yeah, so we're I think a rising institution in the classical liberal world. I want AIER to be the premier, courageous, coherent articulator of a classical liberal vision, and I think we're getting there. We have a great staff. We focus a lot on monetary economics and economic freedom, and then what we call defending freedom and combating collectivism. So we're looking at the most salient challenges that are posed today by collectivists of the left and the right. So I've talked about the problem of economic nationalism, industrial policy, protectionism. We do a lot on that. ESG, wokeism. My colleague Phil Magnus, for example, does a lot on these types of issues of critical race theory, cultural Marxism. Sam Gregg, a lot on trade and ESG. But again, we don't cover every issue area, but we cover some of the most important ones that relate to economics and economic freedom. And we do a little bit of foreign policy. I was been on the show before because war is the health of the state.
Yeah.
And you're not going to have a lot of economic freedom if you're in a wartime economy.
You can't monetize endless war without bad fiat money.
Yeah,
as it turns out.
Right, and these are interconnected.
Yeah.
And our founder, Colonel Harwood, was a colonel in the military, worked for MacArthur, but he was someone who cared about the balance of power. You read his writings, and not just talking about monetary policy and gold, but also talking about the balance of power being important. So I think it fits nicely those things together. And again, we're going to kill it on behalf of freedom, but we do it from a scholarly basis. We're not pundits, but we like to speak to the everyman, but we base it in good economic research.
Okay, where do we get this book? This is a pre-copy, but it's out today, right? It's out by the time people see this.
Yes, Amazon, one place to get it, but they can also get a full-text PDF if they want to read it digitally at the Cato Institute's website and at freedominthefivzerostates.org.
Cool. This was good stuff. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.